Hello and welcome to the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. My name is Jasper Oorthuis and I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare. Tonight I'm joined by Murray Dahm, Mark DeSantis, Mark McCaffrey and Lindsay Powell, and as always Angus Wallace of the History Network is in the studio making sure we sound good. Though of course whatever we say is our responsibility and does not reflect on him at all. Today we're going to discuss the latest issue, 13.1, which deals with the various warlords who were invited by the Greco-Italian city of Tarentum at the end of the 4th and the early 3rd century BC. We've been here before, of course, when we looked at the campaigns of Pyrrhus of Epirus in issue 6.4. That, however, is 7 years ago, and the period is interesting. Don't you agree, Lindsay?
Like I heard a couple of nights ago in the context of Alexandria in the sort of the 4th century, it's between times, isn't it? It's sort of Greece is sort of past its best in some regards, and Rome isn't yet there. So it's an interesting 100-year period or so.
It also represents the first instance of the encounter of the Roman legion with the Macedonian phalanx as the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC. And the whole legion versus phalanx is one of those very different military systems, both of which had great amounts of success over the years against varied opponents. And this is the first of the classic matchups that we see. And there was at least 3 of them between Rome and Pyrrhus in a 5-year period.
I think it's interesting that in this issue, I think it's about the only way you can legitimately have in not even a century, but just over half a century. You've got a Macedonian-style army. You've got actual Spartans, although they're not, classic Spartans. They're slightly over-the-hill Spartans, but they're still Spartans. We have Greeks from Magna Graecia who probably still fight in the old style. And you have the southern Italians who fight in their own way. And you've got early Romans. It's like everybody pile on.
It's also important for the historians as well, because all those, when you get to sort of the late Republic and you've got all those individuals trying to do a great world history as such, it's the point where they're sort of trying to bring it all together. And I think they are emphasising that point as well.
And it's, of course, it's against the background of first the campaigns of Alexander the Great himself, and the successive wars, which, the historiography is, very problematic there very quickly. And then Rome is really at the point of becoming suddenly the one single power in Italy itself. I think that just makes it for a very interesting mix. Plus, there's some very ambitious gentlemen involved.
I think it's a period that a lot of people don't understand terribly well. You get people who are partisan to Imperial Rome or Republican Rome, and you can put your hands around that. And there are people who like sort of Athens and Sparta, but this is sort of in between. It's a challenging period to try and understand in some regards.
It's sold as the precursor to the Hannibalic Wars, and the Punic Wars, and sort of saying, well, to understand Hannibal, you've got to go back to the First Punic War, and to understand the First Punic War, well, you need to understand what happened with Pyrrhus, and that's why we should actually look at Pyrrhus, not because Pyrrhus is important in any way, but it's actually just because he sets the scene, and he sort of gets undersold in that way.
It's also that, of all the Hellenistic generals, there's only one who actually fought the Romans, and he therefore becomes the representative of not only Hellenistic warfare, but even Alexander the Great. And that whole legion versus phalanx speculation is answered through his. I think, there are more people who understand Pyrrhic victory without actually understanding where it comes from and what it actually means. And use it willy-nilly without, who was Pyrrhus? I don't know, just a word. But I think it's a fascinating thing, but it's also a fascinating, that idea of opposition to Rome. That the forces that get allied and hired to resist is quite a fascinating sort of precursor to later warfare, I suppose.
That's the interesting part, is that Tarentum almost never gets mentioned in all this. It's like, we're just talking about Pyrrhus versus Rome, but it's that one. Coincidentally, it's the only Spartan colony that feels threatened by first is just the tribes, the local Italians, and then then feels that Rome is getting a little bit close, and then there's a power play going on, and you get successive. Pyrrhus is only the last one in a line of people who have been requested to come and help, and we had questions about how were those people paid. I'm not sure we actually know. I'm sure we know something about how mercenaries in general were paid. Do we know anything about how a city might go about actually hiring an army?
Well, I think one of the things about mercenaries that gets misunderstood is, of course, that generally speaking, mercenaries would be paid first, and then that's the general or whoever you were hiring would be given a payment for which they would hire mercenaries. The way that I think popular culture views mercenaries is that they get the end, which is like, well, no, because if you don't pay your mercenaries, they're just going to plunder your city or ravage your city, which sometimes happens as a way of paying them, as in, you get to ravage the countryside because they're the enemy and we don't care. So I think that whole misconception that mercenaries actually get paid in advance, and the whole advantage of that is, of course, if you pay your mercenary in advance, they're cashed up when they turn up in your city and therefore spend their wages in your economy, as opposed to being
extracting it from your economy.
and being impoverished when they turn up, so they're unreliable to start.
So let me ask you a question. So what's to stop them, if you've paid them up front, that they hang around long enough to actually provide the service?
Well, I think the general who's hired them might pay them a joining fee, but it won't pay them the balance of their account until they've done their service. And generally, the problem that happens with mercenaries, of course, is that the hiring general has spent that money in the meantime in their lavish lifestyle, and then they end up at the end of the campaign not having enough money to pay their mercenaries, and needing a.
Fortunately, a lot of those are dead by then.
Yeah, well, I think that's where you get the. Arrows cost money, the dead cost nothing from Braveheart. That you don't have to pay your mercenaries if they're dead. And you're like, well, no, because you paid for them in advance. Well, you paid someone for them. They've got to pay them in the rest. But I think that's one of those sort of misunderstandings about how the whole economy works. The Peloponnese being a mercenary, essentially a marketplace for mercenaries from the 3rd century onwards. You hire them up front, not. Yeah,
that's actually an interesting thing that I think it is mentioned at one point in this issue. There's one specific point in the Peloponnese where apparently everybody can just go to. Was it Cape Taniron?
Yep. You just gather, and there it is.
The very southern tip of the southernmost cape of the Peloponnese, and I guess people just hang around there, or perhaps agents hang around there, just going hello.
Yeah. I mean,
have spearable travel.
Yeah. Would you like an army? Yeah. Well, I wonder in this 21st century where billboard hoardings are everywhere. I wonder if on that cape you basically had people with like messages, army for hire, cheap rates. I'll give you 2,000 bowmen for 20 drachma a day.
That would be very well. No, for 2,000 would be very cheap. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as the ships sail past, because that's the route they must take. That southern tip, it's where all seaborne traffic in the Med is going. So it's a very busy highway, and so I think that even though that's anachronistic and analogous, I think it actually there you go. There's two big ones. I wonder if that's actually. Part of the story is that, in fact, yes, they were advertising for their different armies for hire because that's where every potential general was travelling by ship in the period.
It's like the same sort of reason that Delos becomes the centre of the slave trade later on as well.
Yep, absolutely. So I think I think it's the space of sea between the southernmost cape and is it Zakynthos below it? Which is slightly protected from the open sea. I think it's Zakynthos. Ooh.
Well, just coming back to the money question, apparently it's fascinating because Abram actually asks, would they have been paid any local currency, or was their pay entirely in transferable precious materials like gold or other booty? I assume we'll be talking about just if we see anything about money for mercenaries, that would be, and just we're talking about talents of silver and gold.
Well, presumably they were getting food that may have been part of their pay. Maybe it was in kind, not necessarily metallic specie. Because one of the things that I came across when dealing with the end of the First Punic War was when Hamilcar Barca and the Carthaginians had to evacuate Hamilcar Barca's veterans from the fighting in Sicily in 241, is that they were sent back to Carthage to receive all of their back pay, which was a substantial amount apparently. And so it seems that they hadn't been paid in a very long time. In fact, the army sent by, the rescue fleet sent by the Carthaginians to Eryx that resulted in the naval battle of the Aegetes Islands in 241 BC, in which the Romans triumphed. This supply fleet actually had money to pay the mercenaries. So presumably they were owed a lot of back pay at that time. Thus, some mercenaries somewhere were not actually getting paid their full amount on a regular basis. And if what holds true with the Carthaginians was true also with other armies, then I would see that probably everyone was in arrears for some point in time if you were a mercenary.
I have in my head about the Carthaginians that their pay was held in the temple of Baal Moloch in Carthage, in trust, which is why they don't have it on the field, and then it would be doled out from Carthage back to them, so that no one could run off with it in the meantime. I don't know why I have that in my head.
That would be one way to ensure that the mercenaries do what you want them to do, I suppose. And I was thinking while we were saying this that it really doesn't matter very much whether somebody got paid in the local currency or in precious metals, because the currency consists of precious metals. So if it's just a certain weight in gold, doesn't matter if you get that in Tarentum drachma or some other kind of silver or even coppers.
Presumably they would have needed some sort of spending money to handle whatever purchases might have, incidental purchases that might have arisen for a soldier on campaign, and perhaps some of the pay would, as I said earlier, would have been in kind in the form of food, what have you. But the bulk of their pay, I could imagine, would have been somehow not doled out all at once, that they were always in arrears. It just seems to me the more and more you read about mercenaries, the mercenaries are never paid in full. There's always some mercenary that's unhappy with the lack of pay, whether it's the Carthage's mercenaries, it's the Swiss, it's the Landsknechts, it's someone somewhere they're not getting paid in full, and that leads to mutinies and other uprisings.
I think soldiers grumbling about pay is actually just like a standard water cooler conversation. Whatever the ancient military mercenary equivalent of the water cooler is, around the amphora, or the wineskin, who knows?
The perfect one is actually Alexander. His army actually doesn't complain about getting paid, not getting paid. They complain about when he does give a bonus, and they're trying to work out why. Yeah, they're basically saying, are you giving us extra to send us home because you don't like us anymore? And in that case, we'll give it back. So,
But contrasting with the various mercenaries that just about everyone was using, the Romans were not using mercenaries. The Romans had access to a virtually inexhaustible supply of genuine Roman/Italian manpower. And that was what spelled the difference when they were in combat with Pyrrhus. That is, Pyrrhus defeated the Romans twice, but he quite rightly recognizes that he could keep on fighting these battles, keep losing them, that he couldn't replace us, but the Romans could keep on raising legion after legion to confront him, just as the Romans did when fighting Hannibal years later. That is, no matter how many big battles the Romans would fight and lose, they had more people to draft into their armies.
Aren't the Romans at this point, I thought there was an increase in the amount of coinage being produced by the Romans at this point, as you go into the Pyrrhic and then the Punic Wars, and it's basically to say that they're having to produce more coinage because they have to pay soldiers the incentive to say, right, we're no longer just doing the old, seasonal warfare thing. We are now having standing armies because we need them for these campaigns. So we need to entice them out. So we've got to produce more coinage to get them.
Those were not specifically mercenaries. Those were Roman Italian soldiers.
The other problem is there are mercenaries in the Roman service. We get all these sort of anecdotal mentions and source material of groups of Cretan archers being sent to various Roman generals in these wars. So there's clearly a place for them. I think there might be a bias in the sources that we only ever get the legionaries, and that extends into the Roman Empire, that we get legionaries and Romans mentioned. We don't get all of these other forces. We do occasionally get Julius Caesar mentions a whole whack of mercenaries from all sorts of places that he's gathered. So I think that's actually a much more common aspect of Roman warfare that we don't get hardly any evidence for at all in our source material. It's not Zakynthos. I apologise to anyone from Zakynthos. It's Cythera, of course, at the bottom of the Peloponnese.
I just wonder, is it a little bit, I'm not going to say, playing with words a little bit? I mean, if Mark, your point about recruiting troops and you have to pay them, the only difference is that a mercenary is presumably not secured by some sort of vested interest by a citizenry or some sort of homeland interest. He's a hand for hire, a sword for hire. But it all comes down to they have to be paid for the labour. Otherwise, they wouldn't show up to the battlefield.
And it's getting the line between that is blurred at this point as well, because that Roman citizenship is being extended at this time. So where exactly, these guys who would have been mercenaries maybe at one point are now saying, actually, we've got ownership.
Yeah, I think the acid test is, if you just said, guys, we're here to defend the homeland or whatever it is, an army would show up. And unless you produced coin, nobody would show up. So whether they're from another country or whether they're from your country, it still had to be paid.
I don't know if we can, but we probably don't have the data to see if there's much of a difference in how much a Roman soldier at the time would have received and how much I think there have been calculations made how much an average mercenary got at different points in time.
But I'm just wondering, though, that, for example, at this point in time, really, the Roman, as far as we think of them as Romans at all, is really a citizen who's called out, by the sort of the roll call, and they draw lots and they go and serve their country for the season, and they might be lucky to get some spoils, and then they go back to till their fields or whatever they do. Mark made an interesting point there about the fact that now you've got these extended campaigns, and now people are basically serving open contracts, and they risk losing their livelihood, which would have been manning them and tilling the fields, so they have to be compensated somehow. So this comes down to that some people, I suppose, will naturally move towards that because the cash in the hand is worth more than a carrot in the field or something like that. But you kind of get my point. I mean, it's easy money, relatively speaking, although there's a very high risk that, of course, you may not return home.
Well, yeah, the development is certainly going on. It's what is it? The siege of it that they start to pay the soldiery happens at the start of the 5th century, I think. And the development of, the soldiers are away from their fields longer and longer, and that causes difficulties. That culminates in the end in Marius having to go, we have to find a solution because we've lost too many farmers who weren't able to maintain their farm and can't afford to have equipment and all that stuff anymore.
So meanwhile, in the toe of Italy, in the Isle of Sicily, which is where our podcast is set.
Actually, it's the heel of Italy, where Tarentum is. Yes.
Well, he crosses.
Well, yeah, Pyrrhus, and actually some of his predecessors too. Cleonymus, the Spartan general, comes to Tarentum, and then it appears that very often they manage to entice generals to come over who develop their own ambitions that do not necessarily align with those of Tarentum, and which causes a rift in the harmonious cooperation, and they go off elsewhere to Corcyra or Sicily or elsewhere in Italy and see what they can do there, and they might come back, might not come back. So that's actually one of the questions is Mark posed, how did the cities who hired the mercenaries ensure the mercenaries left peacefully when their work was finished? I think the trouble is that they often left before that because they got other ideas.
Or they took over the cities, because there's especially during the First Punic War. If you read Polybius, there's a number of instances where various cities were taken over by the mercenaries that had been hired to protect them. So that happened in obviously most famously in Messana, which started the First Punic War.
Well, exactly. The whole Punic War starts because of mercenaries.
Right, but it also occurred right across the Strait of Messina at Rhegium, and there were a couple of other cities I recall that where various mercenaries had taken over the city in essentially a mutiny, and it wasn't necessarily a huge number of mercenaries, but they were the ones who were trained and had weapons, and they took over, and that was the issue that these cities faced. That is, if the citizenry themselves were not willing to fight, they had to put their defense in the hands of people who were not, generally speaking, from their city and didn't have the same political loyalties that they had, which eventually seems to be what happened to a number of cities in Magna Graecia.
I think the other advantage, of course, of this whole mercenary aspect, as opposed to later mercenary issues, is that they're all speaking the same language, that there's no language barrier between Pyrrhus of Epirus or Cleonymus of Sparta and the cities of southern Italy. They're all speaking Greek, whereas, a lot of the time and a lot of the biases against mercenaries are that they are foreign in the sense that they have a different language group and that they are not of culture, whereas I think there's a great continuity between southern Greece and mainland ancient Greece at this point.
Yeah, though perhaps an Epirot soldier would not have been speaking very Greek.
Well, it certainly seems that southern Italy, Sicily, and mainland Greece proper felt themselves to be part of the same cultural sphere. I think it was. I'm blanking on his name right now, but the ruler of Syracuse was it Gelon? He said that he'd send 20,000 troops to defend Greece against the Persians back in, I think, the 480s or so, as long as they put him in charge of it, right? So that obviously, the Syracusans saw them as part of that, and that was certainly true in the Peloponnesian War, that the people of Sicily, the Greek cities of Sicily, saw themselves as part of the larger Greek world.
Actually, that brings us nicely to the question Lindsay suggested. How did the Greek colonization of southern Italy and Sicily create the conditions for all these wars? Would you like to expound on that?
Well, it just struck me that to some degree that these were colonies of Greeks. So they're exploring people, they're pioneers, and in a sense they're not bounded by the rules of the homeland. I mean, they're out there. To draw an analogy, a little bit like people when the first settlers in the United States. They come here and they're out to explore and grab what they can and keep going until they're told to stop. And if you put two communities who are together like that, I think conflict is inevitable. To some degree, they are satellites of their home polis, so they're going to have the pride that goes with that, but they're also their own people, and they're out to prove their own mission and needs and so on and so forth. So I thought that really, because it was new territory, and there's this kind of a land grab aspect to this thing, that it set it up for conflict.
They'd been a while there by the time we're talking about. Tarentum had been founded at the late 8th century, and it was actually one of the, if not the biggest city in southern Italy at the time.
The perpetuation of the problems of Greek colonies, either trying to break away from their foundations, city-state, or appeal for help from either the city-state or a foreign city-state, is where a lot of the issues of the Greek civil wars occur. Not only in the Peloponnesian War, but later as well. I think there's all sorts of ideas about the Cretan colonies in Sicily that lead to sort of grudge matches later on, and Locri and all sorts of things there, that there's claims on the cities by their foundation city parent, even though they're meant to be independent, and they lose citizenship from their parent city. And then later they get called in, or they make a claim when one of them becomes more sort of famous or lucrative than the host city decides they should be. And I think that's where a lot of the problems of the Greeks come from.
The whole Peloponnesian War starts with Epidamnus and Kyra and Corinth all arguing who's got right over whom.
Exactly. So, so Tarentum's sort of an extension of that, a century later than, and a century and a bit later than the Peloponnesian War. But I think it's that same idea. And I think there's a lot of parent cities who can't cope with the fact that their colonies are now more famous and wealthier than they are. And so they want a piece of that pie.
And then we're coming back to mercenaries. Lindsay again. The use of mercenaries changed the character and duration of military conflicts.
Again, I thought that my thinking behind that question was kind of influenced by what I see in the media here about people who've actually done their military service and kind of get the bug for fighting, find that there's money to be made in it, and going back to my arm, the sword for hire. Some part of it is to do the job quick, get out, take the pay, move on to another project, hopefully more lucrative. So you could argue that maybe takes warfare to a different sort of realm where it's about speed of completing the mission, and actually could be quite brutal because you just want to be sure that you've done the job so you can get out. As opposed to, let's say, a citizen army, which is going to be a bunch of amateurs that are already there defending home turf. And of course, because they are amateurs, I mean, they don't fight maybe with quite the same spine backbone that someone's been doing it for their whole lifetime.
Clearly, there must have been advantages to hiring mercenaries, although, of course, the Tarentine horsemen were famous and became well known as a style of light cavalry, certainly, in the Hellenistic era.
Yeah, that introduces another argument as to were they Tarentine or were they the style, or the relationship to that is a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I know. Hence the word style instead of that they were necessarily Tarentine themselves.
But that's also, I think, applicable to virtually every named group. Were the Balearic slingers Balearic? It's like that's not a very large landmass to be providing slingers for a long period of time, and only slingers. Cretan archers is another. Agriganians, are they all really just Agriganians? Are the Thracian peltasts only from Thrace?
Right, there's also Neo-Cretans.
Yeah, well, exactly. But then I think the issue then becomes, is this a style of warfare that simply people were trained in that way of fighting, and regardless of where they came from? We get Caesar talks about Numidian cavalry. And are they all just from Numidia, only getting them from Numidia? There's so many sort of named groups in ancient warfare in general that may or may not represent a style of warfare that we sometimes say, no, these are only people from this region. Rhodian slingers only come from Rhodes. There couldn't possibly be a Rhodian who's not from Rhodes, which is a very strange conceit that we have, I think. Whereas with others, like the Tarentine or Tarentine light cavalry, it's like, I'm not from Tarentum. They're trained in the style of, which is we can't have it both ways, I think.
So I was just wondering, though, for example, there's two ways I looked at it. Was a mercenary is hired to fight the wars or capture the target, whatever the mission is set as. But on the other hand, a bit like someone on a contract, the longer you can draw it out, the more money you can make. So that would actually say you'd slow the campaign down. So what I'm arguing is a case of, could it be either or?
Well, I think there become conventions within mercenaries, and occasionally we get glimpses in the sources about, when the Romans are fighting mercenaries, they don't understand those conventions because, of course, you're fighting fellow mercenaries. And even though they may be the enemy today, they might be your comrades tomorrow. And therefore, how you fight and how brutal you are and how, I don't think there's a lot of hatred in mercenary warfare because it's a business rather than I think the brutality isn't necessarily there. I think later you get, sackings and things by mercenaries because they don't care about the culture. But I think that there is also a culture within itself that we don't necessarily fight to kill, because they could be our, there's more money to be made in ransom than there is in plunder.
So what I was thinking is, in a sense, you can imagine this scenario when mercenaries fighting the guy defending his town. It's nothing personal. I'm just here for the money. So get out of my way. Let me take the target, or I have to kill you. Those are the choices.
So I think you're right. There's a sort of efficiency and this is a good gig. Let's keep this gig going for as long as we possibly can.
This podcast, as usual, creates more questions than it resolves. Fortunately, we have an issue on Mercenaries coming up. Somebody asked me yesterday on Facebook, why do you already have another issue on Mercenaries coming up? You did that in issue 3.1. And then I pointed out that was 10 years ago.
3.1? 3.1.
I mean, we've just done another podcast about the same issue. So.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem mercenaries have, of course, is that it's very seldom that you get a mercenary historical source, in the regard that you occasionally get an author who might be talking about people from his home city or state who happen to be mercenaries, but very, very rarely.
I mean, other than Xenophon.
Yeah, but I mean, Xenophon's almost in a way, because he's one of them, it's almost like, well, we're not mercenaries really. We're this kind of city on the move, and we're all brothers in arms, and yet at the same time you get, like with the Rhodians and the Cretan archers in his tents, you get that idea that actually they are mercenaries, but there's sort of a cohesiveness to the way he writes about them, which ignores the fact that they're all mercenaries. You get that in later sources too. When you're reading Froissart, for instance, he's like all about chivalry, and you're like, no, these are soldiers for pay. Let's not talk about the chivalric code and how wonderful and upstanding they are. These are hard men who are killing for money.
They're wonderful and upstanding until the money runs out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, not even then. The chevauchée and all of those sorts of charges through the French countryside to plunder because they're French and we're English, and it doesn't really matter. And you do get that occasionally in the ancient world as well, I think. But it's a rare bias. You get the sense that they are mercenaries. There were 280 of them. End of story. We don't get any kind of insight into their. I think later Polybius gives us insight into people going like agents into various cities and hiring mercenaries for particular generals. I think there's some for Mithridates. There's a Dolaison who goes to the cities of mercenaries for someone. So there's this sort of idea of an agent going around and
Mithridates sends somebody across to communicate to Sertorius to negotiate about swapping troops or swapping trainers for their troops. And whatnot.
Yeah. So it's mercenary middlemen, so deal brokers. That's another sort of industry we don't get that much insight into.
I think it says a lot about the actual conflict that we're actually talking about mercenaries. That the sources are actually saying something when they're actually saying this army is characterized by having mercenaries. I mean, it's Roman sources here trying to get away from the situation of actually saying, look, Rome was the aggressor in terms of the Pyrrhic War. That they are, each step they are, really pushing the buttons to further the war, taking the advantage and pushing themselves further into southern Greece and pushing it, but at the same time then they turn around and say, oh, but these guys are characterized by being mercenary armies, so therefore, we've got a legitimate reason to take them on. They are the ones in the wrong.
Is that a question from the chat about the point of the citizen soldier? They don't drag out the war like a mercenary might. Mind you, I think that even in the Athens, you have that problem that when they start to pay their soldiers 3 obols a day, that becomes 1 drachma a day. The problem is that there are people in Athens that are abused in Aristophanes and Eupolis and other comedians, that they are dragging it out. They're citizen soldiers nonetheless, but they're dragging out the war because the pay better than they get off their farm. So they're really bad. They don't know what they're doing. They're crap. They don't know how to row. They're the worst possible candidate, but they're getting paid their 3 obols a day. And so, of course, we want to make the campaign last as long as possible because they get 3 obols a day for the entire time.
But are we talking now about rowers for the fleet, or?
No, I think there's enough that criticism is made of troops around Amphipolis and around Potidaea, and also I was reading a paper recently on the Archer Corps, that the Archer Corps is paid year round. So even though they're archers and therefore not, high status soldiers in an ancient hoplite terms, they are paid a salary, whereas hoplites are only paid on campaign. So if you're an Athenian hoplite, you only paid while you fight. If you're an archer, you get paid, the same rate for the year. So you're far better to join the archers than you are to fight as a hoplite if you can get over the stigma of being an archer.
Well, you never know if there's how much of a bias is going on there, because the archers aren't the hoplites, they're not the hoplite class, and they're certainly not the class that the people who write these things are from.
And bizarrely, of course, in Greece, the Thetes are the rowers, the lowest property class, but the archers are not. There are wealthy archers. There's even evidence of one of the archers taking slaves with him to Syracuse. So that idea is interesting in itself, because this article was David Pritchard, and it was that there are four corps in the 5th century in Athens. There's the navy, there's the army, the cavalry, but the archers corps is the one that gets ignored. But they seem to exist from at least around 483, which again sort of belies that whole idea that there's this status of the hoplite when they've actually got a permanent standing corps of archers from a very early date.
These are not the Scythians who sort of act as a police force?
No, they're later. They're later. So there's a corps from the point that they have per trireme, 10 archers per trireme. So they have to have a permanent
so they're
list
the Marines.
of archers available to serve. No. The Marines separate. You have a number of, I think it's a number of Marines and then a number of archers per trireme, and they're separated out in the.
It's a total of 30, I think.
Yeah. So I think it's four archers per trireme, and that then shrinks in the Peloponnesian War down to 3. But we've got a couple of decrees where we have the names of the archers made, and they're enlisted from citizen bodies, but they also they hire metics as well. So it's a really interesting insight into the social makeup of mercenaries, because of course what Athens does is, if you are a foreigner hired into that corps, you become a metic if you're in Athens for more than a month, and then you are sort of absorbed. So that idea of mercenary is kind of lost in a way. So that you're a foreigner in service to our city, or not one of us, and we certainly will never accept you as one of us, but you're an Athenian by association, much like a New Zealander living in Australia. Should I just say, if we're being analogous? And
that came to mind earlier, actually, but
I'm not doing any fighting, but
In the meantime, we've got slightly distracted from Tarentum and its visitors, invited or not. Anybody want to say anything more about the elephant in the room, the Pyrrhus, Heraclea, and all those things?
Well, one of the things I see about the use of elephants is that Pyrrhus won his victories at Heraclea and Asculum with elephants, and it's very confusing trying to tease out just exactly how he utilizes elephants tactically, because in his 2 victories, he had starting out 20 elephants, and so let's assume that he had 20 elephants at Heraclea, and then whatever number he had later on at Asculum, but they are not. It appears that they're not committed to the battle immediately, and it's not clear to me whether or not he held them in reserve which would seem what the sources that you read, because there's Plutarch, there's Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and also there's Cassius Dio. That is, it's not clear whether or not he kept them in reserve, and then deployed them at a critical moment in the battle, which is what the sources seem, or whether or not they went into battle from the get-go, fought the cavalry, the Roman cavalry on each wing, and then were brought in to deal the death blow to the Roman center, because the Alexandrian model, when Pyrrhus is fighting a battle according to Alexander the Great's tactics, would be is that the elephants deal the decisive blow. It may be that Pyrrhus just didn't have all that many to use right out of the gate. That is, with 20 elephants, that maybe he had to keep them in reserve and pick his spot for that charge, or it could just be the way that the sources are written. That is, they were doing various things on the wings, fighting the Roman cavalry, scaring them, because the Roman cavalry, the horses didn't like the elephants. And then finally they came in at the end to deal the decisive blow to the Roman legions in the center. For example, it was at Asculum, where it's stated in Plutarch that the Romans charged the phalanx to try to defeat the phalanx before the elephants could get brought up into the battle, and that it seems that they fought for quite some time, because the possession of the field changed hands 7 times. That is, it was back and forth, until the elephants finally showed up. So at this juncture, a relatively small number of elephants proved to be crucial to Pyrrhus's victories, and years later, at 275 BC, the elephants did not cooperate, did not bring Pyrrhus victory, because apparently, and this is one of the stories, there's other stories about what happened with the elephants, but apparently what you would have to do is you would have to bring an elephant calf onto the battlefield along with its mother, or the mother elephant would be too anxious and not, I guess, and partake in the battle. However, the story goes is that one of the elephant calves was wounded, possibly hit on the head by a javelin, and being wounded, then ran from the battlefield, followed by its mother, and that created essentially a chain reaction with the other elephants all departed, and that spelled the end of Pyrrhus's attempt to defeat the Romans at Beneventum.
The only thing I can say immediately is that the reconstruction of Heraclea and the current issue suggests that it was just a mess, basically.
It's very difficult to tease out from the sources how all of the various sources that we have for these battles is precisely what happened. They don't agree on a lot, except that it was the Romans versus Pyrrhus, and it may have been that you could try and harmonize the various elements there, but for example, in at least one situation at Asculum, Plutarch says that the battle took place over 2 days. There were 2 fights, and Dionysius has it just occurring, I think, on one day. So that right there's a difference, in a very stark difference.
So one of the most interesting things about elephants in warfare is, they are a big part of Indian warfare. They are in the Persian army against Alexander. They're used by the Carthaginians against the Romans. They're used by Pyrrhus. And they're used by the Hellenistic kings against each other. How ineffectual they are, and how often they are completely redundant in the battle, or they are a disaster on their own troops. And I wonder why they continue to be employed when they're so either ineffectual or unreliable. It's kind of like they are
It has to be the optics, plus...
I think they are. They're an intimidating presence.
But you can imagine there's some guy says, hey, I've got this troop of elephants and we can do great things. They'd probably not use that often, I'm going to guess. And of course, not many people ever get to see these in action. So as long as you can convince the commander-in-chief that it's worth trying it out, they'll probably go, yeah, okay, we'll give it a go. Without realising
fairly expensive things to keep if you're describing it as just a gimmick like that. in terms of the feed that they need daily, in terms of the care, and if you're trying to maintain that core and thinking for the long term, we want to either try to breed or actually try to, restock the herd. It's a fairly big task to actually keep it going.
Well, I know, but I
just
think,
for that.
But see, if you're a king who's got apparently endless resources, do you really worry about those sorts of things?
Pyrrhus is struggling in terms of manpower by the end of his time in Italy.
Well, maybe this is his Wunderwaffen. Perhaps he thinks that this is going to be the thing that tips the scales in his favour.
Well, that's why he brought them, evidently, we assume. And at least the first time, it scared the Romans enough that the next two battles we read about all kinds of ways that the Romans try to neutralize these elephants.
And I think what's very interesting is that I'm not aware that the Romans use elephants in their own warfare, so they obviously understand that the optics are great, but the tactical advantage is minuscule. It's something
they do use them later on.
They do, yeah.
Caesar uses them in what's it? Just trying to think.
Well, there is one
battle that
Dio Cassius says
is it Africa?
Yeah.
When he's fighting against oh god, can't think of it now.
See, this is the point. It didn't happen that often.
Yeah.
No, it's true.
And the only place you're going to use them is probably in a triumph. For example, like Claudius takes an elephant to Colchester or Richborough, wherever he does, because nobody has seen these things before. And they again, we come back to this optics thing, but tactically, not much use.
No, but optics matter.
Yes, they do. Well, it's like the Germans in the First World War seeing tanks the first time. Didn't they call them the equivalent of shooting mobile Panzerkampfwagen, or Schützengraben or something?
But they were interesting. They were very, very much in the mode of chariots. They were an optic terror weapon. They were going to do this thing. But again, the ubiquity of chariots in warfare is like, yeah, but they never do. They're able to defeat, sort of never really have a great impact on warfare, and yet they're revived. You've got Vegetius and the anonymous Rebus Bellicus calling for them to be armies in the 4th century AD. Scythed chariots. They'll win us the war against the Persian. Crazy.
All these things have, ancient warfare is so much more about morale than I think we see. But isn't it at Cunaxa that Xenophon's hoplites deal with the scythe chariots easily enough, but the rest of the army, the Persians apparently, they run amok there. So it's just, it's one of those things that if the army, if the opponent keeps their cool and chucks all kinds of missiles at the elephants, or keeps closed ranks against the scythe chariots, or opens lanes to let them through, there's not very much effect. But
they've got their uses. I mean, if you think about when Perdiccas attacks across the Nile and he uses elephants to actually attack a fort, and you hear Ptolemy defending that fort and actually targeting all of their firepower on the elephants, fearing that they are the ones that are going to cause the breakthrough.
Oh, so if you make them turn and run, they're going to be as damaging to their own force. If you turn an elephant around, they're going to charge back through their own men.
That's the Fort of Camels, and the end result is that, well, according to Ptolemy's source, Ptolemy is the one to turn the lead elephant round and have it charge back down into the river through the supporting troops. But
I guess behind there's always a sweet talking animal commando who says, "Yeah, I could do it, King. Just give me the chance. I can do it, King."
Give me the money first, and then
the elephant whisperer. Yeah, the elephant whisperer.
Well, in terms of Eumenes, in terms of the allies that he gathers around him, the guy who actually bribes in terms of the most is the guy who has all the elephants.
Well, we have 2 questions left. One is, do we know how much wealth the Spartans brought back home to Sparta out of Italy? I think the answer is I don't think we know.
I think there's also, if we did know, the Spartans, because they were still trying to hold on to their old Spartanness, even though it's well gone, wouldn't have let you know how much wealth they had because they'd be run out of town being un-Spartan.
Also, Cleonymus' career is not very glorious after his return. And then, this is a good one to end up with. Were there any well-known companies of mercenaries for hire, such as the second Sons? Are they the Golden Swords?
The Golden Sword.
Yeah,
Golden Company.
Golden Company in Game of Thrones. I mean, I'm not sure.
There's the infamous Mamertines that from Campania, which seized power in Messana and lit the fuse for the First Punic War. They actually held together for a long time. One of the things about the Mamertines, if we're going to distinguish them from the Golden Company and the Second Sons, is that while the Mamertines stayed together for a long time, the sense that I get is that they effectively seized power in a city and held power over that city. They were not traveling from employer to employer, so that they were not like maybe later medieval mercenary companies that we might know from, say, Renaissance Italy or something like that.
I think it's hard to know what we touched on earlier, where you've got these groups generally by a geographic location named throughout sort of warfare. So Cretan archers occur reliably from the Peloponnesian War all the way through to Julius Caesar and beyond. And they're always hired as Cretan archers, which is tricky to, are they a group? We were talking before about agents, so that, I've got a group of Rhodian slingers, Balearic slingers, Thracian peltasts, Agriganians, obviously, under Alexander, Numidian horsemen under Caesar, Tarentine horsemen. These are all recognizable names of troop types who you don't even in the sources need to say Cretan archer. You can just say Cretan and people will know what you're talking about. You can just say Balearic, you can just say Numidian.
And
people
Murray,
will know.
In my business, that's called branding, right? They have such name recognition, brand values, a selling proposition. As you just said yourself, you don't need to explain it to anybody. They know what that is. The Romans had the Batavians. They knew exactly what that meant. And you just bring them and they do their job, and the brand it holds.
So I suppose in that regard, yes, there were known companies, but they weren't necessarily a continuity. They were a brand that you could purchase into.
The only thing I think of, we had an article in issue 11.1 by Nick Wright, who looked at coinage with coin stamps that suggested a route for a certain unit of Cretan archers, which might be an indication for a cohesive unit that operated over a longer period, instead of lots of individuals that fought in the same way that you might hire and fire.
Yeah. I mean, that's there are there's the Spartan drill masters as well, who get hired out as people able to train your troops in a Spartan manner, who get sort of name dropped everywhere else. I mean, one of the other things about Pyrrhus of Epirus is he's the one who's credited with the origins of these military handbooks on how to train your phalanx. It's Pyrrhus of Epirus who starts that trend, and all of the later literature, all the way down to Arrian. It always begins with Pyrrhus of Epirus being the first one who codifies military handbooks. Now, the first examples of military handbooks are Xenophon and Aeneas Tacticus in the 4th century, but it's Pyrrhus who's apparently the one who says, one book on how to raise a phalanx, give me that, I'm going to collect his books and books, let's put them all together. And then Alexander does it, Pyrrhus does it, Pyrrhus's son, Alexander does it. There's interesting origins that Pyrrhus is sort of the professional soldier par excellence, because he's the one who first codifies handbooks on how to be a soldier, even though his end isn't so glorious.
What a great way to end it.
Yeah, I think we should. I'm sorry about the legendary war pigs, but we've actually had an article about those as well in issue.
Apparently, there is there may be some foundation for that, because Aelian brings up the flaming pigs. That is, the Romans coated some pigs with pitch and then sent them against Pyrrhus's elephants at Beneventum, and that it was not the wounded calf that spelled the end of his fortunes, but actually it was the pigs. And interestingly enough, apparently there is a coin struck at some point in time in the ancient world where there's like I guess there's an image of that. But then again, the elephant calf and the mother are also attested to, at least in some form of plate, I think that is. So
when we ran that article, I looked for the sources. I think there are 2 or 3 different events where this was supposed to have happened. Perhaps slightly stronger sources than...
It could very well have just been a wonderful story that people could not forget, and they like the story so much. There's the thing about these sources when you deal with the various battles between Pyrrhus and the Romans is that there's so much circumstantial elements to these battles that. So, for example, the various wagons, the anti-elephant wagons that the Romans had, it's a very bizarre thing. I would strike me as being that there was probably some element of truth to it, that I could also see that the Romans doing something with the pigs. I mean, I don't see how you would ever prove it one way or another, but I don't think that just, superficially that you would just have to discard any possibility about either the flaming pigs or the wagons or what have you. That it all seems like there's some element of plausibility there that we'll never actually be able to say, yeah, that's what happened.
Oh, it is. But I think the fact is that in that single anecdote of this one tactic worked once, then gets extrapolated out into this is a permanent standing unit of the Roman army that in various video games is like elite and can destroy entire foreign forces.
Exactly. This is all due to Rome Total War, from the very first edition. All right, we'll leave it at that for now. I'm sure this is a topic we can keep discussing till the cows come home, and we will certainly turn back to it sometime in the future. If you'd like to read more about this topic or other topics that have to do with anything about ancient warfare, you can subscribe to Ancient Warfare magazine at www.ancient-warfare.com. And if you just like to support the podcast, if you enjoy it, go to Patreon and look for Ancient Warfare Podcast, and you can just help us out there. Thank you, and good night.